Well, now to new details in a case Fox 5 has been following since it began. The husband of missing D.C. realtor Brian Walshe pleading guilty to disposing of her body.
The table is set for 3. It's the last night of December, and inside a rented colonial in Cohasset, Massachusetts, a coastal town where million-dollar views meet quiet, tree-lined streets, Brian Walshe is hosting a small New Year's Eve dinner. She's 39 years old, a real estate executive who built a career good enough to demand 2 cities' worth of her time. Weekdays in Washington, D.C., weekends and holidays back home with her husband and their 3 young sons. Tonight, home wins. Across from her sits her husband, Brian. Beside them, a family friend named Jem Mutlu, invited over to ring in the new year the way people do, with wine, conversation, and the particular optimism of a calendar about to reset. Nobody at that table could have known they were watching the final hours of a woman's life play out in real time. Midnight passes. The new year arrives the way it always does, indifferent to what's coming. Anna says her goodnights. And somewhere in the hours that follow, nobody outside that house will ever know exactly when. She stops existing in any way the world can track. At 3:14 in the morning on January 1st, her cell phone goes silent. No more outgoing calls, no texts, no location pings. It simply goes dark, and it will never come back on. 3 days pass before anyone raises an alarm. 3 days in which a husband tells anyone who asks that his wife left suddenly for a work emergency in D.C. 3 days in which investigators would later argue evidence was disappearing from that house piece by piece, into trash bags, into dumpsters, into a landfill nearly 30 miles away. Think about how ordinary those 3 days would have looked from the outside. A colleague assumes a missed meeting is just a scheduling hiccup. A friend assumes a delayed text is just a busy week. Nobody is running toward an alarm bell that hasn't rung yet because nothing about a quiet, unremarkable Tuesday or Wednesday screams tragedy. That's precisely what makes those 3 days so unsettling in hindsight. Not that anyone failed to notice something obvious, but that nothing about the outside of this story looked obvious at all, even as investigators would later argue that everything necessary to disappear a person was happening just behind a closed front door. Brian Walshe's body has never been found. Not in Swampscott, not in Peabody, not anywhere searched in the years since. And yet a Massachusetts jury would eventually look at everything left behind. The internet searches, the cash purchases, the blood, the timeline, and conclude, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly what happened to her and who was responsible. This is the story of a no-body murder case. This is the murder of Brian Walshe. If you're new here, this is the Homicide Room. Hit subscribe before we get into how investigators cracked a case with no victim ever found. Every true crime case has a version of before, the ordinary stretch of time that only becomes significant in hindsight once everyone knows how the story ends. For Anna and Brian Walshe, before looked like a marriage stretched thin across 2 states, held together by momentum more than anything else. Anna was born in Serbia and rebuilt her life in the United States, eventually becoming exactly the type of professional who gets described admiringly as tireless. Real estate is not a forgiving industry for anyone trying to balance it against a family, and Anna's version of that balancing act was more extreme than most. A full working life in Washington, D.C., colleagues and clients who knew her as a D.C. executive first, and a home life 90 minutes north in Massachusetts that she returned to whenever the job allowed. She was, by every account that would later surface, deeply committed to her 3 sons. 2, 4, and 6 years old at the time all of this began, even as her career pulled her away from them more often than any parent would choose if choice were the only factor at play. Brian Walshe, 50 years old, occupied a very different kind of shaky ground. He wasn't commuting between 2 cities or juggling 2 professional identities. He was waiting to learn how much of his freedom a federal court was about to take from him. Months earlier, he'd pleaded guilty to a fraud scheme built around counterfeit art. Paintings represented as authentic works by Andy Warhol, sold to buyers who believed they were purchasing a piece of a legend rather than a forgery built to imitate one. It's the type of crime that sounds almost cinematic when you say it out loud. Forged Warhols, moved for profit, until you remember what it actually meant for the man who committed it. a federal fraud conviction, a sentencing date looming somewhere on the calendar. A very real chance that Brian Walshe's future involved a prison cell, regardless of anything else happening in his life. So that was the house at the end of December 2022. A mother stretched between two cities and slowly, quietly falling out of love with the arrangement holding her marriage together. A father facing the collapse of his own freedom, with nothing yet decided, and three small children who had no idea that either of those pressures existed, let alone that they were about to converge. The strain wasn't hidden from everyone. Testimony that would surface years later, once the case reached trial, described a marriage under real duress. Stress serious enough that Anna had become involved with someone else, a man in Washington named William Fastow, in a relationship that existed alongside her marriage rather than after any formal end to it. It wasn't a secret kept perfectly. Friends and acquaintances on both coasts of this bi-coastal life had pieces of the picture, even if nobody had the whole thing. None of that, on its own, explains what came next. Marriages fracture under distance and financial stress and infidelity constantly, and the overwhelming majority of them do not end in violence. But context matters in a case like this one, because prosecutors would eventually argue that everything sitting beneath the surface of the Walshe marriage, the affair, the impending sentencing, the money at stake, gave Brian Walshe both a motive and a breaking point. Whether the jury believed that argument in full is something we'll get to. What matters here, at the beginning of the story, is simply this. By the time that New Year's Eve dinner was served, two people who had built a life together were already, in every way that counted except the legal one, pulling apart from each other. It helps to understand exactly how Anna Walshe built the life that eventually pulled her toward Washington in the first place. She hadn't inherited a career or married into connections that opened doors for her. She'd immigrated, established herself in an intensely competitive industry, and worked her way into an executive-level real estate role through what colleagues would later describe as relentless drive. That drive came with a cost, the same cost it extracts from countless working parents balancing ambition against family. Long stretches away from home, a calendar dictated by clients and closings rather than school pickups and bedtime stories, and a persistent, low-grade guilt that seems to follow successful working mothers in particular, regardless of how much their income supports the household. They're accused, subtly or otherwise, of neglecting. Brian's path looked nothing like hers, at least by the time January of 2023 arrived. The art fraud case that had consumed the final stretch of his freedom involved counterfeit paintings attributed to Andy Warhol, pieces manufactured to imitate the unmistakable style of one of the most recognizable artists in modern history, then sold to buyers who had no reason to doubt their authenticity. It wasn't a small-time operation or a single lapse in judgment. It was a scheme substantial enough to draw federal charges, and by the time he pleaded guilty, Brian Walshe was a man whose professional identity, whatever it had been before, had been replaced entirely by his status as a defendant awaiting sentencing. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem to. A person facing financial ruin reacts differently than a person facing prison. A person facing both, simultaneously, while also watching a marriage deteriorate under the weight of distance and infidelity, occupies a particular psychological pressure that prosecutors would later argue pushed Brian Walshe toward an outcome far more permanent than anything a courtroom could have imposed on its own. Anna didn't know how little time she had left. Nobody does, in stories like this one. She hosted her dinner, poured her wine, said goodnight to a friend who had no idea he was about to become one of the last people to ever see her alive, and went to bed in a house that, within hours, would become a crime scene nobody outside its walls could yet imagine. It's worth pausing here to consider how many marriages carry exactly this particular quiet, unresolved tension without ever tipping into anything close to violence. Distant strains, relationships constantly. Affairs happen, and most of them end in divorce lawyers' offices rather than in dumpsters. Financial pressure and looming legal consequences push people toward all kinds of destructive decisions: bankruptcy, addiction, estrangement from family, long before they push anyone toward homicide. What makes the Walshe case a genuine outlier isn't the presence of strain in the marriage. Strain like this exists in countless households that never make it into a documentary. What makes it an outlier is the specific, documented sequence of decisions that followed. Decisions that, according to the evidence prosecutors ultimately presented, moved this particular story from ordinary marital collapse into something far darker, far faster than anyone around the Walshes could have anticipated. What happened next didn't announce itself. There was no scream a neighbor could report, no struggle caught on a doorbell camera, no witness who heard anything unusual from a quiet colonial on a quiet street. There was only silence, followed by a story that would start falling apart the moment anyone bothered to check it. Here's the version of events Brian Walshe told people in the days that followed. Anna had gone back to Washington early. A work emergency, he said. Something urgent enough to pull her away from her family without much warning, which, given how her job normally operated, wasn't an inherently unbelievable claim. It might have worked if anyone with the ability to check it had bothered to ask her employer directly. Nobody did, at least not right away. And that's the uncomfortable engine driving the first several days of this case. Anna Walshe was, by every measure, a responsible and reliable professional. The idea that she'd simply stop responding to colleagues, stop showing up to meetings, stop existing inside her own career without a word of explanation, should have set off alarms far sooner than it did. Instead, for 3 full days, the story that a busy executive had rushed off for work went largely unquestioned. It finally fell apart on January 4th. Not because Brian changed his story, and not because anyone in his immediate circle grew suspicious, but because Anna's employer noticed her absence and did what any employer eventually does when an employee vanishes without explanation. They reported her missing. Around that same window, Brian filed his own missing persons report. On paper, that might look like a husband finally taking action. In practice, investigators would later frame it very differently, not as the beginning of a search, but as a man calibrating his response to match a situation that had just spun outside his control, now that someone outside the household was asking questions he could no longer deflect. That 3-day gap between Anna's last confirmed contact and the moment anyone officially raised the alarm is, in the eyes of prosecutors, one of the most damning stretches in the entire case. Time is not neutral in a homicide investigation. Every hour that passes before police are looking for someone is an hour available for something else entirely. Cleaning, disposing, constructing an explanation sturdy enough to survive a few casual questions, even if it could never survive a real investigation. Prosecutors would later argue, plainly, that those 3 days gave Brian Walshe exactly that head start. Missing persons cases involving adults operate under a frustrating reality that most people don't fully appreciate until they encounter it directly. There's no mandatory waiting period under the law, but there is, in practice, a form of institutional inertia that favors patience over urgency in the earliest hours. Adults are legally allowed to leave without notice. They travel unexpectedly. They go quiet for reasons that have nothing to do with harm. Police departments, understanding this, generally don't treat every unanswered phone call as a crisis, and family members, understanding the same thing, often extend the benefit of the doubt to a spouse's explanation long before they'd extend it to a stranger's. That combination of legal reality and everyday human trust is what allowed a story as thin as "she left for a work emergency" to survive as long as it did, in a case where almost nothing else about the underlying situation was ordinary at all. Once Anna's employer did step in, the shift was immediate and dramatic. A missing persons cases involving a well-known professional, reported by an employer rather than a family member, tend to move quickly through a department's priority list. And this one did. Within a short window of the report being filed, investigators were already treating Brian Walshe not simply as a grieving husband to be supported through a frightening situation, but as a person of interest whose account of events needed independent verification. That shift in posture from sympathetic bystander to active suspect happened faster than Brian appears to have anticipated, and it's arguably the moment the case against him truly began, even though formal charges were still weeks away. And it wasn't an idle few days. While Anna's coworkers wondered why a famously dependable colleague had gone quiet, and while the people around Brian accepted a story about a sudden work trip, a very different sequence of events was unfolding inside that Cohasset home, one that had nothing to do with locating a missing wife and everything to do with making sure she couldn't be found. It shows up first, not in a police report or a witness statement, but in something far more ordinary and far more damning, a browser history. If someone you loved vanished and their spouse gave you a story like this, would you have believed it? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. There's a particular dread that builds in a case like this one, watching from a distance years later, knowing how it ends. It's the dread of the missed window. The 3 days when a phone call to Anna's DC office, made by almost anyone in her orbit, could have unraveled the entire story in an afternoon. Nobody made that call in time, not because anyone was careless in some unforgivable way, but because the story Brian told was plausible enough, delivered calmly enough, by a husband who by every outward appearance had no reason to lie about something so easily checked. That's often how these cases work, and it deserves attention rather than a quick pass. The lies that succeed longest aren't the elaborate ones. They're the boring, believable ones. A work trip, a sudden meeting, a spouse who travels constantly for a living anyway. Brian Walshe didn't need an airtight alibi in those first 72 hours. He needed only enough plausibility to buy time, and for 3 days, that's exactly what he got. When investigators eventually reconstructed those days in full, they weren't reconstructing a search for a missing woman. They were reconstructing the actions of a man managing a problem. One who understood, correctly, that the story he'd told would eventually collapse, and who used every hour that story bought him for something other than looking for his wife. Because long before investigators pulled a single trash bag out of a transfer station, they pulled something else, a record of exactly what Brian Walshe had been searching for online in the hours after his wife stopped existing in any traceable way. And once you see what he was looking up, the work emergency story doesn't just become implausible. It becomes almost impossible to believe anyone repeated it with a straight face. Some pieces of evidence in true crime cases require an expert to interpret. Forensic timelines, DNA transfer patterns, blood spatter analysis. These are things a jury needs a specialist to explain. And then, occasionally, a piece of evidence comes along that requires no expert at all, because any person with a phone and an internet connection understands what it means the instant they hear it. That's what the Google search history became in the case against Brian Walshe. According to prosecutors, in the hours and days immediately following Anna's disappearance, someone sat down at a device connected to the Walshe household and began researching. Not missing persons resources, not grief support, not anything a frantic, worried spouse might look up. Instead, the searches allegedly ran toward how to dispose of a body. How long it takes a body to decompose under different conditions. How, in the crudest and most direct sense, a person might get away with murder. Read that back for a second, because it deserves real consideration. This isn't a case built on suspicious circumstantial inference or a chain of assumptions strung together to imply guilt. If the search history is exactly what prosecutors say it is, it's someone conducting real-time research into concealing a homicide during precisely the window when his wife had gone silent, and he was telling everyone around him a very different story about where she'd gone. It would be easy for a script like this one to treat that search history as the whole case. A smoking gun so obvious that everything else becomes a formality. It isn't quite that simple, and we'll get to why in a later chapter. But it's impossible to overstate how much weight that digital trail carried once it reached a courtroom, because search history doesn't lie the way people do. It doesn't have a story to protect. It's just a record, time-stamped and preserved, of what someone wanted to know at exactly the moment they wanted to know it. The search history wasn't happening in isolation, either. On January 2nd, a single day after Anna's phone went dark for the last time, prosecutors say Brian Walshe got in his car and drove to a Home Depot in Rockland, a town not far from Cohasset. What he bought there and how he paid for it would become one of the most quoted details of the entire case. The receipt, recovered later by investigators, totaled somewhere around $450 in cash. Cash, not card, a small but telling choice given everything else surrounding it. The items themselves read like an inventory built for exactly one purpose: mops, cleaning brushes, rolls of tape, a tarp large enough to cover something substantial, buckets, baking soda, a substance well known for neutralizing odor, a Tyvek suit, the sort of full-body protective covering used by people trying to avoid contaminating or being contaminated by whatever they're about to handle, complete with boot covers and a hatchet. None of those items, purchased individually, would raise an eyebrow at checkout. Cleaning supplies are cleaning supplies. Tarps get bought for 100 mundane reasons. Even a hatchet on its own is just a hardware store tool, but store surveillance footage captured something that turned this routine purchase into something far more chilling. Brian Walshe, moving through that Home Depot in a black surgical mask and blue gloves, paying in cash for a cart's worth of items that, taken together, look far less like a home improvement run and far more like preparation. He likely thought paying in cash would leave no trail. He was wrong. Not because cash transactions can't be untraceable, but because a security camera doesn't care what currency changes hands. It simply records who walked through the door, what they carried to the register, and how they behaved while doing it. And what it recorded, prosecutors argued, was a man dressed to avoid leaving any trace of himself on whatever he was about to do next. There's an almost universal blind spot in how people think about avoiding detection, and it shows up again and again across cases like this one, a fixation on financial traceability. Cash instead of card, no paper receipt tied to a bank statement, paired with a near total disregard for the dozens of other ways a modern retail environment records a person's presence. Loyalty programs, license plate recognition in a parking lot, employee memory in a store small enough that a masked, gloved customer paying in cash for hundreds of dollars of cleaning supplies and a hatchet is exactly the sort of transaction a cashier remembers, whether or not they think anything of it in the moment. And above everything else, the cameras themselves, mounted at registers and throughout aisles for reasons that have nothing to do with homicide investigations and everything to do with routine retail loss prevention, running constantly, recording everyone who walks through the door regardless of how they intend to pay. Brian Walshe avoided one type of trail and walked directly into another, seemingly without recognizing the difference. This is the part of the case that turns a missing persons report into a homicide investigation. Make sure you're subscribed before we get to what investigators found next. It's tempting, watching a case unfold this way, to think the story is essentially over the moment, a search history, and a suspicious shopping trip surface. It isn't. Buying cleaning supplies isn't a crime. Searching disturbing terms on the internet isn't, by itself, proof of anything either. People search strange things for strange reasons all the time, and a defense attorney can make exactly that argument to a jury with a straight face. What actually turns speculation into a case prosecutors can bring to trial is what happens to those purchased items afterward, where they end up, what they're found next to, and what science can say about them once they're recovered. And that's where this story heads next, out of a Home Depot parking lot and into a landfill. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here, one that shows up again and again in cases built on digital evidence. People vastly overestimate how private their online activity actually is, and vastly underestimate how permanently it's recorded. A search typed into a home computer feels, in the moment, like a private thought, something closer to an internal question than a public statement. It isn't. It's a time-stamped record, stored, retrievable, and in this case, ultimately presented in a courtroom as some of the most consequential evidence prosecutors had. Brian Walshe wasn't undone by a single dramatic mistake. He was undone by the accumulation of small, everyday technological choices. A search here, a cash purchase there. Each one individually deniable, none of them individually enough to convict, but devastating once laid end to end in front of a jury asked to consider all of it together. It's worth noting, too, how quickly the timeline moved. Less than 48 hours separated Anna's phone going dark and her husband standing in a Home Depot checkout line with a cart of cleaning supplies and a hatchet. That's not the timeline of a man methodically covering his tracks over weeks of careful planning. It's the timeline of someone reacting, moving fast, making purchases in the same general burst of activity as the searches, as if the plan and its execution were unfolding almost simultaneously rather than as two carefully separated phases. Prosecutors would later use that compressed timeline to argue premeditation regardless. The searches themselves, conducted before or immediately after the fact, still spoke to intent and awareness, even if the broader disposal effort had the frantic, improvised quality of someone managing a crisis rather than executing a plan rehearsed for months. Investigators never found Anna Walshe. What they found instead was almost everything her husband had allegedly used to make sure she never would be, discarded across 2 locations north of Boston, as if throwing the tools away somewhere far from Cohasset would be enough to disconnect them from what they'd been used for. The trail led first to Swampscott, a coastal town roughly 40 minutes north of Cohasset. It wasn't a random search location. Swampscott is where Brian Walshe's mother lived, and investigators zeroed in on dumpsters in that area as part of the broader effort to trace where evidence from the Cohasset home might have ended up. From there, the search widened to a transfer station in Peabody, one of the facilities where regional trash ultimately gets sorted, compacted, and processed before it disappears into the waste stream entirely. It's not a location most people would think to search for evidence of a homicide. It's exactly the sort of place someone might count on investigators never bothering to check, given how quickly trash moves through a system like that and how easily it can become genuinely, permanently lost. Investigators checked anyway, and what they pulled out of that transfer station became the single most important physical evidence in the entire case: 10 trash bags, recovered from among the volume of waste passing through the Peabody facility and containing, according to prosecutors, an inventory that lined up almost item for item with the Home Depot receipt from days earlier. Towels, rags, the Tyvek suit, or what remained of it, gloves, cleaning agents, still in their containers or emptied out entirely. Sections of carpet and rug, cut or torn in ways that suggested deliberate removal rather than routine disposal. A hacksaw. The hatchet was purchased in Rockland. Cutting shears. And mixed in among all of it, not a tool, not a cleaning product, but something unmistakably personal. Anna Walshe's own COVID-19 vaccination card, discarded alongside everything else, as if it were simply more trash to get rid of. That last detail tends to land harder with audiences than almost anything else in this case, and understanding why matters. A hacksaw can be explained away in the abstract. A vaccination card belonging to a specific, named, missing woman thrown into a garbage bag alongside blood-stained tools is much harder to rationalize as coincidence. It's the sort of detail that turns an evidence list into a story. The moment a jury or an audience watching a documentary years later stops thinking about tools and receipts in the abstract and starts thinking about the person all of it actually belonged to, and the science backed up what the items alone implied. Every one of those recovered pieces, the hacksaw, the section of rug, the towels, tested positive for blood. Forensic scientists working out of the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory ran DNA analysis on that blood, along with hair recovered from inside the same bags, and matched it to Anna Walshe. Not blood in general, not an unidentified sample requiring further investigation. Her blood on tools capable of causing exactly the type of injury a hacksaw and a hatchet are built to cause. The trail didn't end at the dumpsters either. Investigators searched the rental home in Cohasset, the same house where that New Year's Eve dinner had been hosted just days before Anna vanished, and found blood in the basement. Not a token trace easily explained by a routine household accident, but blood significant enough to become its own piece of forensic testimony at trial, linking the place where Anna was last confirmed alive to the physical evidence recovered miles away. The basement search itself unfolded over an extended period, not a single afternoon. Homes aren't designed to be searched forensically. Carpet has to be pulled back, baseboards checked, drains examined, surfaces swabbed in a systematic pattern that leaves nothing to chance, because a single missed corner can mean a crucial piece of evidence goes undiscovered entirely. Investigators worked through that Cohasset rental methodically, treating every room not as a family's home, but as a potential crime scene requiring the same rigor they'd apply to any other. The basement, in particular, drew sustained attention once early testing suggested the presence of blood. A finding that, once confirmed through more detailed lab analysis, became one of the clearest links between the house where Anna was last seen and the violence that investigators believed had occurred there in the hours immediately following. It's worth noting how unglamorous most of this actual work was, compared to how it eventually got summarized in a single sentence of trial testimony or a single line in a news article. Weeks of laboratory analysis, Dozens of swabs and samples, most of which likely yielded nothing usable at all, discarded quietly without ever becoming part of the public record. Cross-referencing purchase records from a hardware store against items recovered from a landfill nearly a month later. None of it happened in the dramatic, condensed way true crime storytelling sometimes implies. It happened slowly, carefully, and largely without fanfare, by investigators and forensic scientists whose names rarely make it into headlines, building a case one confirmed detail at a time. Put all of it together, laid out in sequence rather than scattered across separate reports, and the picture stops requiring much imagination. A house with blood in its basement. Tools carrying that same woman's DNA, discarded at a transfer station nearly 30 miles from where she was last seen. Protective gear and cleaning supplies purchased in cash 2 days after her phone went dark, worn by a masked man on store surveillance footage, then thrown away alongside the very evidence they'd apparently been used to try to erase. And in the middle of it all, almost incidentally, a vaccination card that made sure nobody looking at those bags could pretend, even for a moment, that this was about anything other than Anna Walshe herself. There's a particular grim irony running through this entire chapter of the investigation, one that's easy to miss on a first pass through the facts. Brian Walshe's plan, if the searches and purchases prosecutors described reflect an actual plan rather than a panicked improvisation, appears to have relied heavily on the idea that trash disappears, that once something leaves a house in a bag, it effectively ceases to exist, swallowed by a waste system too vast and too indifferent to ever give it back up. For the overwhelming majority of what passes through a transfer station, that's essentially true. Garbage is designed to vanish, functionally, if not literally, into landfills and processing systems built specifically so that nobody ever has to think about where any of it actually ends up. It's a system optimized for forgetting. It only failed him because investigators refused to accept that premise. They treated the waste stream not as a dead end, but as a lead, one requiring exactly the sort of unglamorous, methodical effort described earlier in this chapter, but a lead nonetheless. In doing so, they turned the one part of Brian Walshe's apparent plan that should have worked flawlessly into the very thing that supplied prosecutors with their most damning physical evidence. Out of everything recovered, the hacksaw, the blood, the vaccination card, which piece of evidence do you think would have been hardest for a jury to look past? Let us know below. It's an overwhelming amount of physical evidence for a case that, on paper, still had no victim at its center. Anna Walshe's body was never recovered, not at that transfer station, not in Swampscott, not anywhere else investigators searched in the years that followed. And that absence, more than any single piece of evidence recovered from a dumpster or a basement, would become the defining challenge of the trial still to come. Prosecutors had built what looked, on its face, like an overwhelming case. They still had to convince a jury to convict a man of murder without ever being able to show them the person he was accused of killing. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what searching a transfer station actually involves. These facilities process enormous volumes of waste on a daily basis, material arriving from dozens of municipalities, compacted and sorted, and moved along on a schedule that doesn't pause for a police investigation. Locating 10 specific trash bags inside that volume isn't a matter of walking in and glancing around. It requires narrowing a search window based on pickup schedules and route timing, coordinating with facility staff who understand the flow of material better than any outside investigator could, and then committing to the exhausting, unglamorous work of physically sorting through what most people spend their lives trying never to think about again. Investigators pursued that work anyway, understanding that if Brian Walshe had been careful enough to dispose of evidence across 2 separate locations, the chances of anything incidental turning it up on its own were close to zero. The forensic work that followed the recovery was its own extended process. DNA analysis isn't instantaneous, and matching biological material recovered from discarded, contaminated trash to a specific individual requires careful laboratory work, extracting usable samples from blood that had been exposed to the elements and mixed in with everyday refuse, running comparisons against reference samples, and documenting a chain of custody sturdy enough to survive cross-examination. At trial, every one of those steps had to be defensible, because a defense attorney only needs one weak link in a forensic chain to introduce doubt about everything downstream of it. The fact that this evidence held up, that the blood on the hacksaw, the rug, and the recovered hair all matched Anna Walshe with a consistency the defense couldn't meaningfully challenge, speaks to how methodically the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory handled a case that had, by that point, already drawn national attention. There is a particular type of pressure that comes with prosecuting a homicide when the victim's remains have never been found, and it has almost nothing to do with the strength of the physical evidence otherwise available. It has to do with human psychology, the deep, almost instinctive expectation jurors carry into a courtroom that a murder case should, at some point, produce a body. When it doesn't, prosecutors aren't just proving facts. They're overcoming an absence that can feel, to some jurors, like doubt all on its own, regardless of what else has been established. That was the task facing Norfolk County prosecutors as they prepared to bring Brian Walshe to trial nearly 3 years after Anna's disappearance. Every search, every basement stain, every trash bag pulled from that Peabody transfer station had to be woven into a case sturdy enough to stand entirely on its own because the most intuitive piece of proof, the victim herself, would never be part of it. They built that case around 3 interlocking pillars: motive, opportunity, and a forensic and digital trail thorough enough to leave almost no gaps for a defense to exploit. Motive came largely through testimony about the state of the Walshe marriage in the months leading up to Anna's disappearance. William Fastow, the man Anna had become involved with in Washington, D.C., took the stand and described a relationship that existed alongside her marriage, and a woman who, by his account, struggled with how much her career and her commute kept her separated from her 3 young sons. That testimony did double duty for the prosecution. It established a motive rooted in the collapse of a marriage, and it painted a picture of Anna herself, not simply a victim in a case file, but a mother genuinely wrestling with the cost her career was extracting from her family life in the final months before that life was taken from her entirely. Financial pressure supplied a second thread. Brian's pending federal sentencing for the counterfeit Warhol scheme meant his freedom, his finances, and his professional reputation were all hanging in the balance at the exact moment his marriage was unraveling. Prosecutors argued that convergence, legal jeopardy stacked directly on top of marital collapse, gave Brian Walshe a breaking point that an outwardly unremarkable New Year's Eve dinner did nothing to reveal. Opportunity came from the timeline itself, anchored by the last person known to have seen Anna alive besides her husband, Jem Mutlu, the family friend who joined them for that final dinner. His account of the evening, combined with the moment Anna's phone activity stopped entirely at 3:14 that morning, gave prosecutors a narrow, well-defined window in which everything else in this case had to have happened. No wide gap of unaccounted time for a defense to point to. No alternate suspect with access to that house in those specific hours. Just Brian, in a home that would soon yield blood evidence in its basement in the hours immediately following the last confirmed sighting of his wife. A narrow timeline matters enormously in circumstantial cases like this one, and the reason is worth spelling out in plain terms. Defense attorneys build reasonable doubt, in large part, by identifying gaps. Stretches of unaccounted time where an alternate explanation could theoretically fit. Another person could theoretically have had access. Another sequence of events could theoretically explain the same physical evidence. The tighter the timeline prosecutors can establish, the fewer gaps exist for that sort of alternate theory to occupy. By anchoring Anna's last confirmed contact to a specific minute, and by establishing exactly who had access to that home in the hours immediately following, prosecutors closed off nearly every avenue a defense might otherwise have used to introduce doubt about who was actually present when the violence prosecutors alleged took place. And then came the trail that tied all of it together. The searches, the Home Depot purchase, the trash bags, the DNA. Over 8 days of testimony, prosecutors called nearly 50 witnesses. Law enforcement officers who'd conducted the searches in Swampscott and Peabody, forensic scientists who'd matched blood and hair to Anna Walshe, colleagues and friends who described the marriage and the days surrounding the disappearance. It was a methodical, evidence-heavy presentation, built less around dramatic testimony than around the sheer accumulated weight of everything investigators had recovered. The defense's strategy, by contrast, was built almost entirely around restraint. They called no witnesses of their own. Brian Walshe did not testify in his own defense, a decision that, in any criminal trial, carries real risk. Jurors are legally instructed not to hold a defendant's silence against him, and most take that instruction seriously. But silence in the face of an 8-day prosecution case, built on blood evidence, search history, and a timeline with almost no unaccounted gaps, is a considerable gamble, regardless of what the law technically permits a jury to infer. It suggested a defense team that, faced with the volume of evidence stacked against their client, calculated that nothing Brian Walshe could say on the stand would do more good than staying quiet. There's also a detail from the pretrial period worth including here, because it complicates the story rather than simplifying it, and honest true crime coverage should make room for complications rather than smoothing them away. The lead investigator on the Walshe case, Trooper Michael Proctor, was also the lead investigator in an entirely separate, unrelated Massachusetts case, the prosecution of Karen Red, which ultimately ended in a mistrial after Proctor's own conduct and communications during that investigation became a significant point of controversy. The defense in the Walshe case raised questions during pretrial proceedings about whether that history warranted scrutiny of Proctor's role here as well. It's important to be precise about what that means and what it doesn't. Proctor's conduct in an unrelated case doesn't, on its own, undermine the physical evidence recovered in this one. The DNA matches, the surveillance footage, and the recovered items existed independently of any single investigator's credibility, verified through laboratory processes rather than personal testimony alone. But it's a legitimate thread in the broader story of how this case was built. And it's the type of detail a thorough account owes its audience, rather than quietly leaving out because it doesn't fit as cleanly into a narrative of investigators getting everything right. By the time closing arguments wrapped, the question in front of the jury wasn't really whether something terrible had happened to Anna Walshe. The physical evidence had made that almost impossible to dispute. The real question, the one this entire case ultimately turned on, was whether the state had proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the man sitting at the defense table was the one who did it and had planned to. That's not a small distinction. It's the difference between a conviction for murder and a conviction for something lesser. And it would come down to how seriously 12 jurors were willing to weigh circumstantial certainty against the one thing they'd never get to see for themselves. Given how long this case had taken to reach trial, nearly 3 years from Anna's disappearance to opening statements, and given how much evidence both sides had to work through, there was reason to expect deliberations that stretched on for days. They didn't. After a 2-week trial, the jury returned its verdict following roughly 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty. First-degree murder, the most serious charge available, requiring proof not just that Brian Walshe caused his wife's death, but that he did so with premeditation. A deliberate, planned act rather than a sudden, impulsive one. Alongside that verdict came convictions on 2 charges Brian had already pleaded guilty to before the trial even began, in a surprise move made right as jury selection was getting underway, misleading a police investigation and improper conveyance of a human body. Those pleas had always represented a strange middle ground, an acknowledgement that he'd lied to investigators and unlawfully disposed of a body, paired with a continued denial that he'd killed Anna in the first place. The jury's verdict closed that gap entirely. It's worth pausing on what that outcome represented beyond the 4 walls of this one case. Norfolk County's district attorney told reporters afterward that, to the best of his recollection, this marked the first time his office had secured a first-degree murder conviction without ever recovering a victim's remains. That's a significant marker in the world of criminal prosecution. Not because no body convictions are unheard of nationally, but because they remain rare enough in any given jurisdiction that achieving one says something specific about the strength of the case that made it possible. 12 jurors looked at searches, receipts, blood evidence, and testimony, and concluded that the totality of it eliminated reasonable doubt. Even with the most obvious piece of proof, a jury instinctively wants completely absent from the courtroom. Brian Walshe, by most accounts from inside that courtroom, showed little visible reaction as the verdict was read aloud. No outburst, no collapse. Just the same restraint that had defined his defense's approach from the beginning carried through to its final moment. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence under Massachusetts law for a first-degree murder conviction, leaving no discretion for a judge to impose anything less. That lack of visible reaction is itself something worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about how this particular defendant approached the entire ordeal, from the earliest days of the investigation through to its final resolution in a courtroom. Some defendants, faced with an overwhelming case, break down, either from genuine grief and remorse or from the simple psychological weight of watching a life collapse in real time in front of strangers. Brian Walshe didn't. He'd approached his interactions with police the same way, according to testimony describing those early conversations. Calm, controlled, offering an account of events that sounded rehearsed rather than raw. That same composure carried him through jury selection, through 8 days of damning testimony, and through a verdict that ended any possibility of ever living outside a prison cell again. Whether that composure reflected genuine innocence maintained under pressure, or something closer to detachment from the consequences of what he'd done, is a question the trial itself was never designed to answer. Juries convict or acquit based on evidence, not on a defendant's emotional register. And in this case, the evidence spoke loudly enough that his silence, in the end, didn't matter nearly as much as the story it was competing against. The sentencing hearing itself, held 2 days after the verdict, offered one of the only moments in the entire multi-year case where the people affected by Anna's death were able to speak directly, in their own words, about what her loss had meant. Victim impact statements in cases like this one rarely make national headlines the way a guilty verdict does, but they matter enormously to the people delivering them. A chance, however incomplete, to describe a loss that a legal proceeding can never fully account for, no matter how thorough the surrounding investigation and trial turn out to be. Outside the courthouse, prosecutors spoke about the case in terms that extended well beyond the legal outcome itself. They pointed to the 3 children Anna and Brian shared, 2, 4, and 6 years old when their mother disappeared, now facing a childhood and eventually an adulthood without her. It's easy, over the course of a case built so heavily on searches and receipts and forensic testimony, to let the human center of it slip into the background. Norfolk County's district attorney made a point of pulling it back into focus, whatever else this case had become. A landmark no-body prosecution, a case study in digital evidence, a documentary subject watched by strangers years later. It began and ended with a mother who never came home to the sons who needed her. If you want us to keep covering cases like this one, hit subscribe now and drop a comment telling us which case we should dig into next. Every high-profile homicide case leaves 2 separate legacies once the verdict is read. A legal one, measured in sentences and appeals and case law, and a cultural one, measured in how relentlessly the public keeps returning to it long after the courtroom empties out. The Anna Walshe case has both, and they're worth separating from each other because they tell different stories about why this case mattered as much as it did. The legal legacy is, in some ways, the more consequential of the 2, even if it's the less discussed one online. A first-degree murder conviction secured without a recovered body sets a meaningful precedent within a jurisdiction because it demonstrates to future prosecutors and future juries that the absence of remains doesn't have to mean the absence of certainty. Cases like this one become reference points. Prosecutors building future no-body cases in Massachusetts, and likely well beyond it, will study how Norfolk County assembled its evidence, how it sequenced witness testimony across 8 days, and how it managed to make jurors comfortable reaching the most serious possible verdict without the one piece of proof they instinctively wanted most. The cultural legacy is messier and more familiar to anyone who's followed true crime coverage for more than a few years. This case became national news almost from the moment Anna was reported missing, well before anyone knew how it would end. A real estate executive, a bicoastal marriage, a husband already tangled in an unrelated federal fraud case, all of it unfolding in an affluent Massachusetts coastal town that doesn't typically generate this sort of headline. That combination of ingredients, proximity to wealth, an already compromised suspect, and a mystery with no body to anchor it, made the case irresistible to national outlets from the earliest days of the disappearance, long before a single trash bag had been recovered. that level of attention cuts in more than one direction. It meant sustained public pressure on investigators to solve the case thoroughly and correctly at every stage, knowing the outcome would be scrutinized far beyond Norfolk County. It also meant Anna Walshe herself, and later her children, became public figures in a story none of them chose to be part of. Their names, their family photos, their private grief, all absorbed into a national news cycle that moves on eventually, but rarely gently. There's a tension embedded in every true crime documentary, this one included, and it deserves to be named rather than quietly ignored. Telling this story clearly and thoroughly serves a real purpose. These cases matter. The forensic and investigative work deserves to be understood. And audiences who watch shows like this one often walk away more informed about how the justice system actually functions in the hardest cases it handles. But it's also true that Anna Walshe was a real woman, not a character built for narrative purposes. And the 3 children she left behind are living a complicated, pain-fueled life somewhere outside the frame of every video made about their mother's death. The best true crime storytelling holds both of those realities at once, treating the case with the analytical seriousness it deserves, while never losing sight of the fact that at its center is a family that didn't ask to become a case study. As for Brian Walshe, his legal story likely isn't fully finished. Life without parole convictions in Massachusetts remains subject to the appellate process, and it wouldn't be surprising, given how high-profile and evidence-dense this trial was, to see appeals filed challenging elements of how the case was presented. The admissibility of certain forensic testimony, questions raised about the lead investigator's history in an unrelated case, or procedural issues from a trial that unfolded over years of pretrial motions and delays. None of that changes the verdict as it stands today. But it's a reminder that in cases this significant, the courtroom chapter rarely closes as cleanly or as permanently as a single guilty verdict might suggest. There's also a broader lesson embedded in this case for anyone paying close attention to how modern homicide investigations actually unfold, separate from the specific facts of what happened to Anna Walshe. A generation ago, a case with no body and no confession might well have struggled to reach trial at all, let alone secure a conviction on the most serious charge available. What changed isn't the fundamental nature of murder investigations. It's the sheer volume of digital and forensic infrastructure now woven into everyday life, mostly invisible until a case like this one drags it into the light. Search engines log queries. Retailers keep footage. Crime labs can extract usable DNA from samples that would have been effectively useless to investigators working a generation earlier. None of that infrastructure was built with homicide investigations specifically in mind. It exists for entirely unrelated commercial and technical reasons. But its side effect, in cases exactly like this one, is an investigative net far finer than anything available even 20 years ago, one that made it possible to build an airtight case around a victim who was never found, using nothing but the trail her killer left behind while trying to erase her from the record entirely. CTA beat. Engagement prompt. Do you think cases like this one deserve the level of national attention they get, or does that attention end up doing more harm than good to the families involved? We'd genuinely like to hear your take in the comments. What remains constant, regardless of appeals or continued coverage, is the fact this entire case was built around a woman who hosted a dinner, said goodnight, and never had the chance to see her sons grow up. Everything else, the searches, the forensic science, the 8 days of testimony, the 6 hours of deliberation, exists because investigators refuse to let her disappearance become just another unsolved case, another name that fades out of headlines once the initial search efforts wind down without an answer. Anna Walshe hosted a New Year's Eve dinner in the home she shared with her husband and sons, and within hours of that dinner ending, she was gone. Not missing in the way people are sometimes simply, tragically missing, but erased, deliberately and methodically, by someone who had every reason to want her disappearance to look like anything other than what it was. She was never found. Not in Swampscott, not in Peabody, not anywhere searched in the years since January of 2023. What was found instead was enough. Enough searches, enough receipts, enough blood, enough testimony to convict the man she married of first-degree murder, and to do it without ever placing her remains in front of a jury. That outcome doesn't happen often. It happened here because investigators refused to let an absence become an excuse, and because the trail Brian Walshe left behind, despite every attempt to erase it, turned out to be more permanent than he apparently believed it would be. There's a version of this case that could have gone very differently if the transfer station in Peabody had processed those 10 bags just a little faster. If nobody at Anna's office had noticed her absence when they did. If a jury, faced with an unrecovered body and a defendant who never took the stand, had decided that circumstantial certainty wasn't quite the same thing as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. None of those things happened. And the reason they didn't comes down to a combination of methodical investigative work and, in a case like this one, no small amount of luck. The type of luck that meant a security camera happened to be running, that a landfill happened to still contain what investigators were looking for, that blood happened to survive well enough in a basement and on a hacksaw blade, to be tested years after the fact. Cases like this one exist as a reminder of something both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. Reassuring because it demonstrates that even a homicide committed with real planning and real effort at concealment can still be unraveled, piece by piece, by investigators willing to search transfer stations and basements and search histories with equal thoroughness. Unsettling because it took every one of those pieces coming together. Nothing less would have been enough to secure a conviction in a case where the most fundamental piece of evidence a jury usually relies on was never available to them at all. Anna Walshe's sons will grow up understanding their mother largely through court transcripts, news coverage, and cases like the one you've just watched, rather than through the accumulating everyday memories a childhood is supposed to be built from. They'll have photographs. They'll have the accounts of people who knew her before any of this happened. Colleagues who remember her as tireless, friends who remember a woman trying, imperfectly and under real strain, to hold together a career and a family stretched across 2 cities. What they won't have is her. And the man responsible for that loss will spend the rest of his life in a Massachusetts prison, having never once had to explain, under oath, in his own words, what really happened inside that house on the first night of 2023. Some cases end because someone finally confesses. This one ended without a single word from the man at its center, and the silence, in the end, was loud enough to convict him anyway. If this case affected you the way it affected us, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more cases from the Homicide Room.